Welcome back, everyone, to the third and final part of our look at the Great Heathen Army and the events that roughly coincide with the History Channel show Vikings and the Netflix series The Last Kingdom. So we're looking at some of the history behind those real events. And so today we're looking at Kings and Generals video on the Danelaw, which will be explained as we go along. We've talked a little bit about it in the first two episodes, and if you didn't see those first two episodes, there is a link in the description that'll take you back to episode 1. Today is the final chance to vote on what the next series will be, the one that I will start tomorrow. And you can do that if you are a patron over on Patreon at any level. Here's where things stand at the moment. So last chance to affect that outcome, and we'll see what happens tomorrow. Let's go ahead and dive into today's episode.
In our previous video, we covered King Alfred's surprise victory over the Vikings at Edington in 878. This victory both ensured the survival of his kingdom and allowed the West Saxons the breathing room needed to prepare for the next inevitable invasion. Though Guthrum retired to East Anglia after the battle, Wessex still faced a potential attack from elsewhere.
And remember, Guthrum has converted to Christianity at this point, so he's considered kind of nominally an ally, or at least he's not somebody who's going to be an enemy moving forward. Even though he still rules East Anglia, which is kind of part of the Danelaw, and there are a lot of Danes there, you figure him not to be a problem.
Just as Guthrum had successfully carved himself out a kingdom, well over a decade after the initial arrival of the Great Heathen Army, another could just as easily come and do the same. Alfred spent the 880s converting the various market towns of his kingdom into burghs, which would act as fortified safe havens and meeting points for local militias.
And so B-U-R-G-H, that term that you see at the end of a lot of towns, that's where that name comes from. So many of the names of cities and towns are getting their identities during this time period.
He also forged a lasting alliance with the portion of Mercia still under Anglo-Saxon control, now under the rule of a warlord of unknown origins named Ethelred after the death of King Ceolwulf in around 879. The alliance was sealed by the marriage of Alfred's eldest daughter, Ethelfled, to Ethelred in the early 880s, who began to rule as a vassal of Wessex.
But Ethelfled will actually go on to kind of run the show herself. She'll be known as the Lady of Mercia. There wasn't really a place for her to be called a queen or anything like that, but she basically was nominally, even if she didn't have that title. But you can start to see here, these are the areas that we're going to know as kind of the Danelaw. This area is the 5 boroughs. And as we get a little further into this, I'll take a look at a map and you can see specifically where the various modern towns and cities of England are in relation to these borders. And you can see that London is in a really interesting situation because they're right where East Anglia, Wessex, and Mercia all come together.
Alfred also achieved a similar arrangement with the southern Welsh kingdoms during this time, whose rulers were hemmed in by the expansionist sons of Rhodri the Great.
And we talked yesterday about how names came along, like Anderson and Hendrickson are names, they're Scandinavian names that mean son of, and that's where those surnames came from. And we talked about how in England it was very often Fitz that was used, especially in Norman English. In Scottish you have Mick, M-C or M-A-C. You have O for Irish names, and you have Ap, meaning, I think, son of, for Welsh names. And sometimes you'll see more than one. You'll see ap something to show kind of multiple generations.
Gwynedd and Powys. The most powerful of these northern Welsh kings, Anarad ap Rhodri, may have allied himself with the Vikings of York against Wessex, before eventually accepting West Saxon vassalage, thus securing Alfred's western border. Ultimately, Guthrum kept the peace with Wessex until his death in 890. However, just 2 years later, the Burr system would face its first real test, when 2 massive fleets of raiders comprised of over 300 longboats under a sea king named Hastein arrived on the Kentish shore.
So just for a second, let's talk a little bit about these longboats. And if you're talking 300 longboats, how many men are we talking about? Because a lot of times in the histories, we don't have numbers of men written down, but we have numbers of boats written down, which gives us an insight into that. So there's a lot of information that's available, and we actually have some of these in existence. The longboats or the long ships go all the way back to several hundred years BC. But they evolved just like any technology does over time. But I think, as far as I can tell from the information available, at this time period, you're talking about a crew of about 40 men to man the oars. Of course, they also had sails on these, and then they would carry an additional 40 or so men. So you're probably looking at 80 to 100 men on each one of these. So that gives you a little bit of insight. And sometimes there'd be massive fleets. Like I think at one point Hamburg, Germany, was attacked by something like 600 of these longboats. So you could probably figure that 300 are maybe going to have at least 2,000 warriors on board.
Yet times had changed over the last decade, and Wessex held out. By 896, Hastine's men either left Britain entirely or dispersed into East Anglia. The Burr system had worked. Upon his death in 899, Alfred left his kingdom to his eldest son and heir, Edward. The succession was not smooth,
And again, should point out that it's really not entirely up to Alfred who he leaves his kingdom to, because that final decision would be made by the ealdormen. So, they would often, go along with the wishes of the previous monarch, but it wasn't a sure thing that it just automatically he was going to be succeeded by his eldest son, for example.
Alfred's nephew, Ethelwald, also made his claim. He fled north into Northumbrian Danelaw, where he was enthusiastically accepted by the local rulers, who were apparently happy to finally conquer the last Anglo-Saxon kingdom once and for all. Ethelwald gathered an army in Northumbria, and by 901 or 902 sailed south to Essex.
Well, I was trying to figure out there why there suddenly wasn't any sound, and apparently they had a copyright issue with some of the music they were using in the background, and so there's no sound in any of this part here. So we're just going to make up our own sound as we go along, and you can see here that Ethelred and her husband had to retreat to the safety of her brother Edward. And all of this, again, these are characters in The Last Kingdom. Edward and his sister Ethelflaed, and her husband Ethelred, and they're going up against Alfred's nephew, Ethelwald here, who's got the support of the Danes. And this is a common thing that would happen where you have some other claimant to the throne. You can't just take the throne for yourself, but if you got some other claimant to the throne that you're willing to support and that will take your side, he'll become an ally, and you will offer your armies to help put him on the throne. This happened many times throughout the history of England, where you would see these kinds of things happening. So we're going to skip ahead a little bit and see what happens. Obviously, Edward, Ethelflaed, and Ethelred have won this victory, and this is going to move things on. Now you've got Guthrum II over here in East Anglia. You've got a period now where this is going on 10 years after Alfred is gone. And things are holding pretty steady. And let's talk a little bit about the Danelaw and exactly what territory we're talking about when it comes to that. So we're talking about a time period for nearly 100 years, from the middle of the 9th century to the middle of the 10th century, in which this area existed that we know as the Danelaw today. And this is what it looked like roughly around the middle of that time, 912. So we're talking about the Kingdom of York in the north. You're talking about the 5 boroughs here, and you can see here the Danish Kingdom of East Anglia. And so now you can get a sense. This is the area known as the Danelaw. This is Mercia. This is Wessex. These are kind of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. So you can see here you got Warwick. So the modern city of Birmingham would be right in this area here. Repton and Derby are in the 5 boroughs. Nottingham's there. So this is kind of the West and East Midlands right here today. Huntington, Cambridge right there. London is going to be right here in this area. Oops, I just kind of messed that up. But London's going to be right in the area where East Anglia and Mercia and the Danelaw all come together. Well, I guess that's the Danelaw too, but that's why London's going to become so important, because it is right there in the middle of all of these things. All right, so we're going to continue for about, I think, another 20 seconds or so without any sound, which is really unfortunate because we don't really know what's going on. So let's skip ahead a little bit to where we get it back. Here comes some more longboats.
Large group of exiles in the lands just to the north of the Mercian-held town of Chester, an old Roman fortress. The Mercians may have hoped for these Irish Vikings to act as a buffer against the ever-present threat of the Danelaw. But by 907, these Vikings had aligned themselves with the Danelaw to besiege Chester. When the Mercian army went north to deal with this new threat, it was Aethelflaed leading them, as Aethelred was incapacitated due to illness. What happened next is unclear, but the Mercians defeated the Vikings at Chester, and now Aethelflaed and Aethelred were firmly in control.
And this is not the only time in history where you have a woman who takes control of a situation on behalf of her husband, a king. A couple of other examples of this later on in history. You have Margaret of Anjou, who is the queen for Henry VI, who basically runs the show while her husband Henry VI is incapacitated due to some serious mental illness during the Wars of the Roses. She's the one who keeps her husband on the throne as long as he did. And another example is when Catherine of Aragon was left as regent, ruling England while her husband Henry VIII was out of the country, and wins a great victory against the Scots.
The Mercians were going on the offensive. At that time, Edward's son Aethelstan was being fostered by his aunt Aethelflaed in Mercia. In 909, he led a raid deep into Viking territory to retrieve the relics of the famed Northumbrian king Oswald. His army also took the opportunity to pillage the lands of Lindsey for 5 weeks before the Vikings in York could react. We're going to talk about Aethelstan in much more detail in the next episode.
There's more episodes? Thought this was
in 910, the Northumbrians retaliated, launching a massive raid deep into Mercia. They ravaged the countryside and loaded up on plunder before beginning the journey back north. It was then, at a place called Tettenhall, that a combined West Saxon Mercian army caught the Vikings by surprise.
So here now you're having West Saxons, the Wessex, the Kingdom of Wessex. We shouldn't really call them nations because the idea of a nation doesn't really exist yet. These are kingdoms. They're under a monarch. They're under a person rather than a set border, a kingdom, or a territory of a nation. But by this point, by and large, Wessex and Mercia can in some ways be viewed as more than allies, almost the same kingdom and not quite. But Alfred's dream was that they would create a united England eventually.
In the ensuing bloodbath, the entire leadership of the Viking force was killed, crippling York for years to come. Tettenhall was a turning point in many ways. It was around this time that Aethelred finally passed away, and quite astonishingly, despite being a woman in a militaristic, male-dominated society, Aethelflaed was chosen as his successor, ruling under the title Lady of the Mercians. However, soon she was forced to relinquish control of London to Wessex. Aethelflaed would continue to rule, though as she had no male heir, it was the beginning of the end for independent Mercia.
But again, kind of a good thing, I think, independent Mercia coming under the sway of Wessex. It's her brother that's ruling Wessex at the time, so even though they're independent, they're really kind of side by side.
For the next 8 years, she tirelessly dedicated her time to building burhs, not only along the frontier with the 5 boroughs to the east, but also against the Welsh kingdoms to the west.
And this is an area that during the time of England is going to be known as the Welsh Marches. And marches are just basically, it's a term that's often used for the borderlands, the area, the frontier between you and some foreign land. You're going to have northern marches, and they're called marcher lords, the ones who are responsible. And these are guys you have to trust. You have to trust them because they're on the border, and they can make or break your kingdom because they're responsible for holding against any incursions by enemy kingdoms.
A state of perpetual warfare existed with the 5 boroughs of eastern Mercia during this time, with occasional raids reported from the towns of Leicester and Bedford into western Mercia. Edward, meanwhile, was finally ready to go on the offensive against the Vikings on his own border. Between 911 and 913, he moved his forces by land and by sea into Essex, fortifying the town of Malden and attempting to bring the area under full West Saxon control. For the first time since the coming of the Northmen, Wessex was gaining new lands, and Malden would become a base from which he could attack East Anglia. Yet, in 914, any potential attacks Ethelfled or Edward might have wanted to make suddenly came crashing to a standstill. Across the Channel in Brittany, a massive Viking fleet had just conquered the entire region, extinguishing its ruling family, and now, under the leadership of 2 warlords named Roald and Ottir, it was coming to Britain.
And here's where you're seeing, you've got Normandy right there, and Normandy, I mean, it literally gets its name from the Northmen. This is when you're going to have eventually the dynasty that will lead to the man known as William the Bastard, who we know as William the Conqueror, who, though he was largely French by that generation, his male line went back to Vikings.
Sailing up through the Bristol Channel, they headed into the River Severn in an attempt to take the Mercians by surprise. Yet, once again, Ethelfled was ready for them, pushing them out of Mercia and into Wales, killing Roald in the process. Edward pursued Ottir and his remaining vessels all the way to the island of Flatholme near Cardiff. Finally, Ottir gave up on England and went across the sea to Ireland. The stage was now set for the final confrontation of the war. By 914, Edward II was making inroads into the 5 boroughs, forcing the submission of some of the Vikings of Bedford and Northampton. By 917, both Edward and Ethelfled were ready for their final assaults upon the Vikings. A large force of Danes from the southern portion of the 5 boroughs allied itself with the East Anglians, who finally decided to make a move. They attempted to mirror the success of the Saxons by building their own burh at Tempsford in Bedfordshire.
Learn from your enemy. If your enemy's doing something that's working, use it. Don't be above the idea that, hey, don't think all the ideas that you have are the best ideas. If your enemy's doing something well, learn from it. That's what they did. They're like, okay, this is working for them. This brought these burhs, these border fortress towns, brought stability to Mercia and Wessex. For the first time, we're not seeing massive amounts of Anglo-Saxon territory being taken away from them. Partly in due to the burh system, but also partly in due to great leadership from people like Ethelfled and to a lesser degree Edward.
Within weeks, however, Edward's forces stormed the burh, killing the East Anglian king, and swept onwards to take the whole of East Anglia and southeastern Mercia. Ethelfled was also on the move. By mid-917, she marched her now elite army across the border and directly towards the borough of Derby, where they laid siege to the town. After a fierce battle, the town fell, and with it, large swathes of eastern Mercia.
So you start to see the writing on the wall now. Wessex has got a lot of power, a lot of territory. They've taken all of East Anglia. They've taken a lot. I mean, that's been one of the more stable. East Anglia and Northumbria are the 2 kind of most stable Danish kingdoms that you have in this realm. And now it's Northumbria is the one that's left. And, of course, you got the Picts that are becoming the Scots. I think King Constantine of the Scots at this point up there in the north. And so they're kind of caught in a really difficult situation now.
In 918, Leicester had also submitted, followed by the other 3 boroughs of Stamford, Nottingham and Lincoln. Under Ethelfled, Mercia had finally completed its reconquest and now found itself with nearly the same borders it had prior to the coming of the Vikings, yet she didn't stop there. In the summer of 918, the Vikings of York agreed to submit to Ethelfled. Ultimately, the deal never materialized, as Ethelfled passed away that same year. She was succeeded by her only child, a daughter named Elfwin. By 918, all of England south of the Humber was under Anglo-Saxon control. Edward marched north to Tamworth to seize Elfwin. She was placed in a monastery for life, and Mercia was finally incorporated into Edward's growing kingdom.
So this is his niece, and this is not an uncommon thing, and it shouldn't be viewed as this awful act of tyranny that he marched in and did this. She's a woman, she's young, and, you know, it could be viewed as a sign of weakness, and in some ways you could argue that he was really doing Mercia a favor by protecting them and placing them under his leadership. But also, now you've got one united kingdom out of all of these previously broken down kingdoms, and there's just so much power here at this point that Northumbria just really isn't going to last very long.
Then, like Alfred before him, Edward achieved the fealty of the 5 Welsh kingdoms, thus uniting most of the land south of the Humber for the first time in history. All that remained in England under Viking control was the Kingdom of Northumbria, and it would have become the next target for Edward. Though just as Edward was annexing Mercia into his ever-growing Anglo-Saxon realm, the Dublin Norse, members of the soon-to-be-feared Eiveth dynasty of Ireland, annexed York in a lightning attack. This created a new threat to the burgeoning United England.
So, not what you would expect to see coming. That, you know, you think Mercia is the threat, and then boom, somebody comes from the west and takes you out. So, the playlist only had these 3 videos, but he made reference to further videos, so there may be more that we explore down the road. But as promised, we'll get into the series that is voted on by the patrons starting tomorrow. And I'll be looking at some other ideas, so I'm always open to ideas for suggestions for videos that you'd like to see me do a reaction to. Next episode in my series from France will be coming out tomorrow, so be watching for that. That is my visit to the Russian Orthodox cemetery on the Western Front, where the Russian Expeditionary Force. Not a lot of people know that there were Russians who fought on the Western Front in World War I. So we're going to take a look at their story in tomorrow's episode. So watch for that. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.